Welcome to a deep dive, into a case that for some reason never really got the same attention as some other true crime stories. We're going back to 1981, Keddie, California. It's a struggling mountain town, a rundown resort, and a single mom named Sue Sharp trying to make a fresh start with her 5 kids. You think you know what a small town is like until a small town becomes the setting for something so brutal that it leaves even the investigators speechless.
What I find fascinating about the Keddie Cabin Murders is how they just embody this idea of forgotten murders. It happened in a place that felt isolated, almost forgotten, and then the case itself just seems to have slipped through the cracks of public awareness.
It's like a double layer of being forgotten. So, okay, let's set the scene. It's April 12th, 1981. Sue, her son, John, and his friend Dana Wingate are found murdered in cabin 28. And not just murdered, they were bound, beaten, stabbed. And to make things even more horrifying, 3 of Sue's younger sons were asleep in the next room the whole time.
God, it's hard to even grasp the sheer terror of that night. The sources we have really emphasize the brutality of the attacks. The details are disturbing: a hammer, a knife. It suggests a level of rage that goes beyond a typical robbery or even just a random act of violence.
And then you add the mystery of 12-year-old Tina Sharp, Sue's daughter, missing from the scene. They wouldn't find her remains for 3 years. And miles away from Keddie, it's like the horror of that night just keeps extending outwards.
The fact that Tina was abducted while the others were murdered just raises so many questions. Was she the primary target? Were the other murders a way to cover up her kidnapping? It's a puzzle where some of the most crucial pieces are just missing.
Speaking of missing pieces, let's talk about the investigation, or rather the lack thereof. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office's handling of this case is almost as shocking as the murders themselves.
Oh, it's a textbook example of what not to do at a crime scene. The sources we have are very critical of how the investigation was conducted. Evidence mishandled, the scene wasn't properly secured, and crucial items like the hammer used in the attacks went missing. They were found years later.
It's almost unbelievable. You'd think a crime this brutal would be met with an all-hands-on-deck approach, but it seems like the opposite happened.
It feeds into that feeling of Keddie being forgotten, doesn't it? Not just by the public, but maybe by the authorities as well.
Absolutely. And then you have these 2 figures who kind of emerge as prime suspects. Martin Smartt, a neighbor who had a contentious relationship with Sue, and his friend Bo Boubede, an ex-con with some shady connections. What's interesting is that their names pop up almost immediately, but the investigation doesn't seem to go anywhere.
Right. Smartt even reportedly confessed to his therapist that he was involved, and both men were seen arguing with staff about Sue at a local bar on the night of the murders. But they were allowed to leave Keddie shortly after the murders, with minimal questioning. It's baffling.
It really is. So we have this brutal crime scene, a missing girl, potentially contaminated evidence, and then these prime suspects who just kind of disappear. How do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, I think the first step is to go back to that night in April and try to piece together what we know for sure. Let's look at the timeline of events, the evidence that was collected, and the witness statements, however flawed they might be. Maybe by reconstructing the events leading up to the murders, we can start to see where the investigation went wrong and why this case remains unsolved. Let's go back to that feeling of Keddie being forgotten that you mentioned earlier. This wasn't just some remote cabin in the woods. The Keddie Resort was once a bustling place, a stop on the railroad line. It had a history, a community.
Yeah, and it seems like that history might be a big part of understanding why this case went cold. The sources paint a picture of a town in decline, struggling economically, maybe even with some underlying tension kind of simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly. You get the sense that maybe some people weren't too keen on outsiders, especially a single mom like Sue with 5 kids, moving into the resort. It's like the town itself was already a powder keg, and then the murders were the spark that ignited it all.
And that brings us back to Smartt and Bo Boubede. If Keddie was already a place that was wary of outsiders, it makes their hostility towards Sue even more significant.
Absolutely. Smart's alleged confession to his therapist is especially intriguing. He reportedly said something about being involved, about getting rid of the problem, but then his wife claims they were both given a free pass out of Keddie by the sheriff. It's like the investigation just went out of its way to ignore a blatant red flag.
Yeah, it's like they were more interested in, keeping up this facade of peace in the town than actually finding out the truth. Do you think that's maybe why this case never got national attention? Because it happened in a place that felt, well, insignificant.
That's a really good question. And I think it's a big part of it. Keddie wasn't a place that, captured the public imagination the way, say, a big city or a glamorous suburb might. It was just a struggling mountain town, easy to overlook, easy to forget.
Right, and it makes you wonder how many other cases like this are out there. hidden in plain sight, just waiting to be rediscovered. Cases that never got the attention they deserved because they happened in places that just felt invisible to the rest of the world.
It's a sobering thought, but I think it also highlights the importance of what we're doing here. Digging into these forgotten stories, trying to piece together the truth, even when it feels like everyone else has moved on.
So if we kind of step back from Smartt and Bo Boubede for a moment, are there other theories that might explain what happened that night? The sources mentioned drug activity in Keddie, and Dana Wingate was found with a significant amount of cash on him.
Right. And that leads to the theory of a drug deal gone wrong. Maybe Dana and John were involved in something they shouldn't have been, and the murders were a message or a way to eliminate competition.
But if that was the case, why target Sue with such brutality? And why abduct Tina? It doesn't quite fit.
Exactly. It's like trying to force mismatched puzzle pieces together. The drug deal theory might explain some aspects of the crime, but it leaves too many questions unanswered.
And it circles back to Tina's abduction, which really feels like the key to understanding this whole tragedy. The sources suggest she might have been the primary target all along, and the other murders were just a way to cover up her kidnapping.
It's a disturbing thought, but it would explain why her remains were found so far away years later. If she was the intended victim, it suggests a level of premeditation that goes beyond a random act of violence or even a drug deal gone wrong.
It makes the crime seem even more calculated, more sinister, and it raises the question, if Tina was the target, who would want to harm a 12-year-old girl?
Right.
And why?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately it's one that the original investigation seems to have completely ignored. There's no indication that they seriously considered the possibility that Tina was the primary target.
Which makes you wonder if they were deliberately overlooking certain possibilities. Maybe to protect someone or to maintain a certain narrative about what happened that night.
Yeah, it's hard not to feel that way, especially when you look at how they handled the prime suspects. It's like they were determined to close the case quickly, even if it meant sacrificing the truth.
So we have this tangled web of conflicting evidence, ignored leads, and unanswered questions. How do we even begin to untangle it? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think one approach is to look for the patterns, the connections that might have been missed by the original investigators. Let's re-examine the witness statements, the evidence that was collected, even the rumors and speculation that circulated in Keddie after the murders. Maybe by looking at the case with fresh eyes, we can uncover something that was overlooked or dismissed as insignificant back in 1981.
I feel like we've been going in circles, you know, hitting these dead ends with each theory.
But maybe that's the point. Maybe the answers aren't hidden in some grand conspiracy or, a single overlooked clue. Maybe it's the very ordinariness of Keddie, the fact that it wasn't a place that demanded attention that allowed this case to fade into obscurity.
It's like the town's own sense of being forgotten somehow infected the case itself.
Exactly. And that makes it all the more important to keep talking about it, to keep asking these questions. Because even if the national spotlight never shone on Keddie, the impact of these murders is still felt deeply by those who were left behind.
The sources talk about the fear that gripped Keddie after the murders. How suspicion just replaced, that neighborly trust. It's a reminder that the effects of violence extend so far beyond the immediate victims.
And they continue to spread, even decades later. Think about the younger Sharp boys who were in the cabin that night. They survived. But can you imagine the trauma they carry, the questions that might still haunt them?
It's heartbreaking. And it makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of an unsolved case. Not just for the families directly affected, but for the entire community.
It's a wound that never fully heals, a constant reminder of the violence that shattered their sense of security. And it reinforces that feeling of Keddie being forgotten. The world moved on, but for those who lived through it, the shadow of that night still lingers.
It almost makes the search for answers feel even more urgent. It's not just about solving a puzzle. It's about acknowledging the pain that continues to echo through the years.
And maybe, just maybe, by bringing attention back to the Keddie Cabin murders, by refusing to let them fade into obscurity, we can help chip away at that feeling of being forgotten. Perhaps someone somewhere holds a piece of the puzzle, a memory, a detail that could help shed light on what really happened that night.
It's a long shot. But it feels important to hold on to that hope, because for the victims, for their families, and for the community of Keddie, justice delayed shouldn't have to mean justice denied.
Well said. And it reminds us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, the pursuit of truth matters. Even in a case as cold and as seemingly forgotten as the Keddie Cabin murders, there's still value in seeking answers, in shining a light on the darkness, and in refusing to let the victims be forgotten.
The woods may be silent, but the story isn't over yet. So what do you think happened in Cabin 28? Share your thoughts, your theories, your insights. Because sometimes the collective curiosity of many minds can be more powerful than any single investigation.
Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and never underestimate the power of remembering.